They called her the Pack's broken shadow. For 20 years, Boudicca Iceni scrubbed the grime from the stones of the Bloodmoon Pack, surviving on the scraps of those who treated her with less dignity than a diseased cur. She was the Wolfless defect, a hollow omega to be mocked, bruised, and eventually forgotten. But they didn't know the ancient lineage slumbering in her marrow. They didn't know that her silence wasn't submission. It was a seal reinforced by poison and forged in fear. When the ruthless Alpha Ragnar Fenrir rejects her before the assembled northern territories, he doesn't just shatter her heart. He shatters the lock on her bloodline. And what emerges isn't a wounded girl. It is a primordial force of nature. Get ready, because the silver wolf has returned, and she is about to make every alpha in the court crawl. The air inside the Bloodmoon Great Hall was a suffocating cocktail of wood smoke, raw meat, and the heavy, musky pheromones of 500 apex predators. It was the night of the harvest moon gathering, a night designed for the strong to feast and the weak to hide. Boudicca Iceni was neither feasting nor hiding. She was kneeling. Her fingers, cracked and stained with the lye she used to scour the floors, throbbed in time with the drums echoing through the stone walls. At 20 years old, Boudie was a living ghost. In a world where your wolf's scent was your identity, she was a void. A genetic waste, as the Alpha's enforcers liked to remind her with the toes of their boots. Look at it. A voice curled through the air, sharp and jagged as broken glass. Boudie didn't look up. She knew the scent of jasmine and cruelty anywhere. Valdis, the Beda's daughter, stood over her, the hem of her crimson silk gown trailing through the dirty suds of Boudie's bucket. 20 years and still no wolf, Valdis sneered, her voice carrying to the warriors nearby. Are we sure she isn't human? Or just some mangy dog the goddess forgot to finish? Boudie gripped the wooden handle of her brush, her knuckles white. The hall will be ready for the Warlord King Valdis. Let me finish. Frick. Valdis's spiked heel didn't just step on Boudie's hand. It ground her fingers into the grit of the marble. Boudie's breath hitched. A sharp gasp of agony she refused to let turn into a sob. That's Lady Valdis to you, Defect, the Beda's daughter hissed. And don't think for a second you're watching the ceremony from the shadows tonight. Alpha Ragnar wants the lower galley scrubbed. Every inch. If I see your matted blonde head anywhere near the throne room, I'll personally ensure the guards use you for target practice. Valdis kicked the bucket. The gray, icy water surged over Boudie, soaking her thin tunic and drenching her to the bone. Clean it up. Again. As the high-ranking wolves laughed and moved toward the feast, Boudie remained in the puddle, her hair, a shade of blonde so pale it looked like frost, hanging in wet clumps over her eyes. She felt the sting of the cold, but beneath it there was a heat. A low, vibrating hum in her bones that had been growing for weeks. She had been told she was a charity case, the orphan of a failed guard. But every time Alpha Ragnar Fenrir entered a room, that heat in her chest became a roar. It was a magnetic, violent pull that made her heart stutter. She feared it more than Valdis's boots. Because for an omega like her to be mated to a beast like Ragnar was a death sentence. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the pack house was shaking. The scent of rain and cedar, Ragnar's scent, filled every corridor, making Boudie's head spin. She had finished the silver. She had scrubbed the galley. But the pull was too strong. Using the service vents she had cleaned 1,000 times, Boudicca crawled through the darkness until she reached the iron grate overlooking the obsidian throne. Below her, the world was a blur of gold and blood. The northern alphas stood in a circle of steel, their eyes fixed on the man at the center. Alpha Ragnar Fenrir was a titan of a man, his storm-gray eyes scanning the room with a bored, lethal hunger. Boudicca's heart slammed against her ribs. "Look away," her mind whispered. "He'll kill you if he finds you." But she couldn't move. And then, as if a lightning bolt had struck the center of the hall, Ragnar's head snapped up. His eyes, cold and predatory, locked directly onto the shadows of her vent. Boudicca fell back, clutching her chest as a searing white-hot brand seemed to burn through her very soul. It wasn't the warmth of a bond. It was the explosion of a dam. Down in the hall, the sound of shattered glass rang out. Ragnar had crushed his goblet in a bare fist. He stood, his chest heaving, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that shouldn't exist. A scent of ozone, ancient snow, and silver. "Mate?" he growled, the word vibrating through the stone floor and into Boudicca's very marrow. He laughed it off. "No, it can't be. Not this waste." But the hunt had begun. And the Bloodmoon Pack had no idea they had been harboring a god in their kitchen. The world of the Bloodmoon Pack began for Boudicca long before the sun dared to touch the jagged peaks of the northern territories. At 4 in the morning, the pack house was a tomb of cold stone and exhaled breath, the air thick with the scent of sleeping predators. For Boudicca it was the hour of the yoke. She stood at the ancient stone well, her fingers, swollen and blue-tinged from the biting frost, fumbling with the iron crank. Every rotation sent a shuddering ache through her shoulders. She was 20 years old, a time when most female wolves were at their peak of physical prowess, their inner beasts providing a constant hum of metabolic heat. But Boudicca was hollow. She felt every degree of the freezing mountain air. She felt the true weight of the 2 massive oak buckets once they broke the surface of the water. "Move it, Defect," a sleepy sentry growled as he passed her on his way to the barracks. He didn't offer to help. He didn't even look at her face. To him, she was simply a piece of the pack's plumbing that hadn't been replaced yet. Boudicca hauled the water toward the kitchens, the rough hemp rope biting into the raw skin of her palms. This was the foundation of her existence. Labor that left no room for thought, or exhaustion so deep it acted as a shield against the reality of her life. She was the Bloodmoon's broken shadow, an omega who couldn't shift, a wolf who couldn't howl. By 6, the pack house began to wake, and with the waking came the sport. Boudicca was on her knees in the main corridor, her long winter wheat blonde hair tied back with a piece of twine. She was scrubbing the mud left by the dawn patrol when a shadow eclipsed her work. She didn't need to look up to scent the jasmine and copper. "You missed a spot, runt," Valdis whispered. The beta's daughter didn't wait for a response. She tipped her porcelain cup, letting a stream of hot, sticky chocolate pour directly onto the patch of marble Boudicca had just buffed to a shine. Boudicca's chest tightened, but she kept her eyes down. "I'll clean it, Valdis." "That's Lady Valdis," the brunette corrected, her voice dripping with honeyed venom. Behind her, 2 other high-ranking females giggled. They were the elite, the future Lunas and Alphas who viewed Boudicca as a cautionary tale of genetic failure. Valdis reached down, her manicured fingers catching a lock of Boudicca's matted hair. Before Boudicca could flinch, Valdis produced a small silver skinning knife. With a flick of her wrist, she sheared off a jagged hunk of blonde tresses. Oops, Valdis giggled, dropping the hair into the puddle of chocolate and lye. It was looking a bit dull anyway. Consider it a favor. Boody's breath came in shallow, jagged hitches. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the water buckets, pressing her face toward the floor. She watched the hair, the only thing she had left that felt like hers, soak up the filth. 20 years old and still can't shift, Valdis sneered, her patent leather heel coming down on Boody's fingers, grinding them against the stone. You're not an Omega, Boody. You're just nothing. A genetic dead end. Honestly, Alpha Ragnar is too kind to let you breathe our air. If it were up to me, you'd be scrap for the rogues. Valdis kicked the scrub bucket, sending a gray, soapy slosh across Boody's dark tunic. Make it sparkle. The harvest moon gathering begins tonight. If the Warlord King sees a single streak on this floor, I'll tell the Alpha it was your laziness that insulted him. And you know what happens to lazy things in this pack. They sauntered away, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Boody remained in the puddle, her hand throbbing where Valdis had crushed it. She didn't cry. Crying was a scent that invited more teeth. Instead, she gathered the sheared hair, her wide, startled eyes reflecting the cracked marble. But as she worked, a strange, terrifying sensation began to pulse in the center of her chest. It wasn't the dull ache of her bruises. It was a magnetic, violent pull, a heat that felt like a low-frequency hum vibrating through her ribs. She had felt it for weeks, but today, with the gathering approaching, it was a roar. It pulled her toward the north side of the house, toward the Alpha's private wing. Every time Alpha Ragnar Fenrir moved through the halls, Boody's skin felt too tight for her body. Her blood felt like it was beginning to simmer. Please, goddess, no. He prayed, her mechanical movements resuming. Let it be the cold. Let it be the fever. She knew what that pull meant for others. It was the fated bond. But for her, to be mated to Ragnar Fenrir, a man who viewed her as a piece of defective furniture, would be an execution. Ragnar was a titan of storm-gray eyes and ruthless efficiency. He didn't want a mate, he wanted a legacy. And a wolfless girl with matted hair and raw knuckles was the death of a legacy. By noon the pack house was a frenzy. The Harvest Moon Gathering was the most significant event in the Northern Territories. It was a display of power, a time for alphas to flex their muscles and for the chain of submission elders to observe the health of the packs. Boody was moved from the floors to the galley. She spent hours hauling massive silver platters, polishing them until her reflection, pale, thin, and haunted, stared back at her. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning, and the scent of roasting venison and spiced ale was a torture. Don't even think about it, the head cook barked, swatting her hand away from a tray of bread. Those are for the warriors. You can have the marrow bones after the hounds are finished. Boody nodded, her throat tight. She moved to the service entrance of the great hall, her dark tunic damp and clinging to her slender frame. Through the heavy oak doors she could hear the drums. The Warlord King, Bleda Attila, was rumored to have already arrived at the gates. Her heart stuttered. The pull in her chest was now so intense it felt like a physical tether was hooked behind her sternum, yanking her toward the high table. Boudicca, get the wine. Valdis shouted from the hall. Booty grabbed the heavy crystal decanter, her hands shaking. She smoothed her hair, trying to hide the jagged patch Valdis had cut, but there was no hiding the truth of what she was. As she pushed through the double doors, the sensory assault nearly knocked her back. The great hall was a sea of fur, silk, and the overwhelming pheromones of hundreds of powerful wolves. The air was thick with the scent of cedar, rain, and cold steel. She kept her head down, her posture hunched as she moved toward the dais. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The closer she got to the center of the room, the more the heat in her blood reached a boiling point. She reached the high table where the most powerful alphas of the north sat. At the center sat Ragnar Fenrir. He was magnificent in his cruelty, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the mountains, eyes the color of a winter sky before a blizzard. Booty leaned over to fill his goblet, her breath hitching. She was so close she could smell the rain on his skin. At that exact moment, Ragnar turned his head. His gray eyes, sharp and predatory, locked onto hers. The decanter slipped in her hand, red wine splashing onto the white linen cloth like a fresh wound. The hall went silent. Ragnar didn't roar. He didn't snarl. He simply stared at her, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent he couldn't identify. Something that smelled of ozone and ancient buried power. "You," he whispered, the word vibrating through the floor and into Booty's very marrow. Booty froze, her wide violet eyes trapped in his storm. The secret in her bloodline, the seal that had kept her nothing for 20 years, let out a single microscopic crack. The harvest moon was rising, and for the first time in her life, the girl in the dirt felt the first spark of the monster within. The iron-bound doors of the great hall groaned on their hinges, swinging wide to admit a blast of mountain air that made the hundreds of torches lining the walls flicker and dance. The harvest moon gathering had officially begun, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from festive to lethal. This wasn't just a party, it was a summit of predators, and the scent of power was so thick it was almost suffocating. Boudicca was still on her knees, her fingers trembling as she attempted to blot the wine she had spilled near Alpha Ragnar's place at the high table. Every cell in her body felt like it was being electrified. The pull she had felt for weeks was no longer a hum. It was a physical tether, yanking at her soul with such violence she felt she might be torn in two. A hush fell over the room as the first of the royal guests arrived. "Make way for the Northern Lion," the herald's voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. Warlord King Bleda Attila entered with the silent, terrifying grace of a winter storm. He was flanked by 12 members of his Onyx Guard, warriors clad in black tactical leather, their faces obscured by bone-white masks. Bleda himself was a titan, his dark hair swept back from a face that looked as though it had been hewn from the very rock of the mountain. His eyes were pits of midnight, scanning the room with a cold, analytical detachment that made even the bravest alphas lower their heads in instinctive submission. He moved toward the dais, his presence pulling the oxygen out of the room. But as he passed the high table, Bleda's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second. His dark eyes locked onto the small, trembling figure in the navy slip dress kneeling in the dirt. He didn't sneer. He didn't mock. He simply watched her with a heavy, piercing intensity, as if he could see the silver fire flickering beneath her ribs. But Boudicca barely noticed the king. Because behind Bleda, The man who held her destiny in his hands finally made his entrance. Alpha Ragnar Fenrir stepped into the light of the central chandelier. He was dressed in charcoal velvet and obsidian furs, a broadsword strapped to his hip that had tasted the blood of 1,000 rogues. He looked like a god of war, his jaw set in a line of granite, his storm-gray eyes scanning his subjects with bored arrogance. Then it happened. The moment Ragnar's foot touched the center of the hall, the air between him and Boudicca seemed to ignite. The pole didn't just snap, it exploded. It was a sensory cataclysm. The scent of rain-drenched cedar and ancient musk hit Boudicca's nostrils with the force of a physical blow. Her heart didn't just beat, it roared. Mate. The word wasn't spoken, but it vibrated through the marrow of her bones. For a heartbeat, the world disappeared. The jeering wolves, the stinging cold, the raw skin on her knuckles. It all vanished. In that split second, a foolish, desperate hope flared in Boudicca's chest. The legends said the mate bond was sacred. It was supposed to be the moment a wolf found their other half, their protector, their home. Ragnar froze in mid-stride. His hand flew to his chest, his fingers curling into the velvet of his tunic as if trying to steady a heart that had suddenly gone wild. His nostrils flared, his head snapping toward the high table with predatory speed. His eyes locked onto hers. The hope in Boudicca's heart died a cold, screaming death. She saw the transition in his expression like a play in 3 acts. First came curiosity, the instinctive search for the source of the scent. Then came recognition, the shock of realizing the mate his wolf was screaming for was the girl currently kneeling at his feet. And finally the soul-crushing finale, disgust. Ragnar's lip curled back, revealing canines that were already beginning to lengthen. The storm in his eyes turned into a blizzard of revulsion. He didn't look like a man who had found his home. He looked like a man who had stepped in something foul and couldn't get the stench off his boot. The hall went deathly silent. The music died in the middle of a chord. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the alpha to the runt on the floor. Ragnar began to move. He didn't run to her. He strode, each footfall a heavy rhythmic thud that sounded like a funeral drum. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, warriors pressing themselves against the walls to avoid the radiation of his fury. He reached the edge of the dais and stopped, looming over Boudicca. From her position on her knees, he looked like a mountain about to crumble onto her. "You again," he spat. The word was laced with such venom that Boudicca flinched as if he had struck her. He reached down, his large, calloused hand grabbing her chin and forcing her head up. He didn't do it with tenderness. He did it to inspect her the way one might inspect a piece of diseased livestock. He tilted her head from side to side, his eyes taking in her matted hair, her thin, pale face, and the stained navy dress that hung off her frame. "You're my mate?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried to the furthest corners of the hall. Boudicca couldn't speak. Her throat was a desert. She could feel the bond humming between them, a desperate, pathetic thing that wanted her to lean into his touch, to seek comfort in the very man who was looking at her with loathing. "Answer me, runt," Ragnar hissed, his grip tightening until her jaw ached. "Is the moon goddess playing a sick joke on me? Are you the one my wolf is howling for?" I feel it too, Alpha," Boudicca whispered, her voice cracking. A murmur of disbelief and mocking laughter rippled through the crowd. A wolfless defect. Valdis's voice rose from the front of the crowd, sharp and triumphant. The Alpha of the Bloodmoon Pack mated to a servant who can't even shift? The goddess must be drunk. Ragnar's face contorted. His pride, his legacy, his entire reputation was being incinerated in the heat of 500 judgmental stares. He looked at the visiting warlords, seeing the suppressed smirks on their faces. He looked at Warlord King Bleda, who remained standing by the pillars, his dark eyes unreadable, watching the scene with the detached interest of a scientist observing a tragedy. Boudicca looked up at Ragnar, a single tear escaping and tracking through the grime on her cheek. Please. Don't speak my name, he growled, shoving her chin away so hard she stumbled back, her scraped knees barking in pain against the stone. He looked down at his own hand as if it were contaminated. The bond was screaming at him to pull her into his arms, to claim her, to protect the small, fragile thing that belonged to him. But Ragnar Fenrir was not a man of the heart. He was a man of the throne. And a throne could not be shared with a broken shadow. Look at you, Ragnar said, his voice now cold and devoid of anything but contempt. You have no wolf. You have no lineage. You have nothing but the dirt under your fingernails. I have spent my life building this pack into the strongest in the north. I needed a Luna who could lead armies. I needed a queen who could bear sons that would shake the earth. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she was forced to lean back against the legs of the high table. And instead, he whispered low enough only for her to hear, I get a mistake. A genetic dead end. You are a stain on my bloodline, Boudicca. You are a humiliation I will not endure. Boudicca felt the dread settle into her stomach like lead. The hall was a vacuum of silence, everyone waiting for the axe to fall. She looked toward the door, toward the service tunnels, toward any escape, but she was trapped in the gravity of his hatred. Across the room, Warlord Bleda took a slow, deliberate step forward. He adjusted his heavy black coat, his eyes never leaving Boudicca. He saw the way she trembled, saw the raw knuckles, and saw the violet in her eyes beginning to pulse with a faint rhythmic gold. He saw what Ragnar was too blinded by arrogance to notice. The seal was vibrating. The pressure was reaching a breaking point. Ragnar turned away from her, addressing the entire room. He raised his arms, his voice booming with the authority of an alpha who was about to defy the gods themselves. Let it be known. Ragnar shouted. The moon goddess may have made a choice, but I am the alpha of this pack and I make the rules. He turned back to Boudicca, his eyes turning a dead, frozen gray. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of our strength, he sneered. But it seems we have some trash that needs to be taken out first. Boudicca's breath hitched. The hope was gone. The dread was absolute. She was a wolfless omega standing before a furious god, and she realized then that the magnetic pull hadn't been a blessing. It had been the bait for a trap that was about to snap shut. The harvest moon was full and blood-red outside the windows, and as the silence stretched to a breaking point, the first microscopic crack appeared in the ancient ice of Boudicca's soul. The silence in the great hall was no longer empty. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made the torches flicker as if the very air were gasping for breath. 500 wolves stood frozen, their predatory gazes locked onto the girl on the floor. Boudicca stayed small, her forehead nearly touching the cold marble, her eyes fixed on the spilled wine that looked like a dark, widening bruise on the stone. Alpha Ragnar Fenrir took a slow, deliberate step back. He didn't just move away from her. He moved as if her very proximity was a contagion. The storm gray of his eyes had hardened into slate, cold and unyielding. He looked up, addressing the crowd, his voice resonating with a terrifying, jagged clarity. "A wolf is defined by their strength," Ragnar began, his voice growing in volume until it shook the chandeliers. "An alpha is defined by the legacy he leaves behind. The moon goddess is a weaver of fates, but even a weaver can drop a stitch. Even the heavens can produce a defect." He looked back down at Boudicca, his lip curling with a hatred so pure it felt like a blade against her skin. "I will not be humiliated by a mistake," he snarled. He stood tall, his chest expanding as he drew in the breath for the ritual. The air grew frigid, the scent of cedar and rain turning into a biting, icy gale. "I, Ragnar Fenrir, Alpha of the Bloodmoon Pack, formally and eternally reject you, Boudicca Iceni, as my fated mate and my Luna." Boudicca flinched as if he had struck her with an iron bar. But he wasn't finished. "Your weakness offends my bloodline," he continued, the ritual magic beginning to swirl around them in visible dark ribbons. "Your defectiveness insults my wolf. Your very existence is a stain on the goddess's design. You are nothing to me. You are nothing to this pack. I sever the bond." The words hit Boudicca like a physical explosion. For 20 years her soul had been a quiet, hollow thing. The mate bond, even as it had only just sparked, had felt like a golden thread suddenly connecting her to the universe. Now that thread didn't just break. It was whipped away with a violence that tore through her spiritual marrow. Boudicca let out a scream that didn't sound human. It was a raw, visceral sound of a soul being ripped in two. She collapsed entirely, her body convulsing on the marble. The agony was absolute. It felt as though her heart were being gripped by red-hot talons and shredded. Every nerve ending in her body flared with the sensation of being flayed alive. The bond shattered like glass inside her chest, the shards piercing every organ. She coughed, a thin trail of blood escaping her lips, her violet eyes blown wide and glassy with shock. Ragnar looked down at the broken thing at his feet, his face a mask of stone. He felt the snap of the bond too, a dull, momentary ache in his own chest, but his pride was a fortress that wouldn't let the pain in. He looked at the warriors of the Blood Moon, the enforcers who had spent years treating Boudicca like a stray dog. "Remove this thing from my sight," Ragnar commanded, his voice devoid of a single ounce of mercy. "The presence of a rejected defect is an insult to the harvest moon. Take her to the Forbidden Outlands. If she is still alive by dawn, the rogues can have what's left." The crowd erupted into a chaotic, mocking roar. Valdis stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a sick, triumphant light. "You heard the Alpha. Clear the trash." Two burly enforcers, men who had often found excuses to discipline Boudicca in the kitchens, stepped onto the dais. They didn't pick her up. They grabbed her by her matted blonde hair and her raw, bleeding arms, yanking her upright. Boudicca was a dead weight, her head lolling, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle. "Ragnar!" She choked out a final, pathetic plea. He didn't even turn around. He reached for a fresh goblet of wine, signaling the musicians to start playing. The enforcers dragged her toward the door. As they moved, the warriors in the crowd reached out. A fist to the ribs, a kick to the thigh, a spray of ale in her face. It was a gauntlet of cruelty, a pack turning on its most vulnerable member to prove their loyalty to a ruthless leader. "Look at the little Omega," one sneered, slamming a hand into her stomach. Boudicca doubled over, the air leaving her lungs in a wheeze. They dragged her through the mud of the courtyard, the freezing rain now turning into a sleet that stung her exposed skin. She was barely aware of the world, only the pain of the rejection and the rhythmic thud of her body hitting the ground as they hauled her toward the forest. High on the balcony, Warlord King Bleda Attila stood in the shadows. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He watched the brutality with an expression that wasn't just disturbed, it was dangerous. His onyx guard shifted behind him, sensing the sudden spike in their king's aura. Bleda's eyes, those pits of black void, never left the trail of blood Boudicca left on the stones. He didn't move to stop it. Not yet. The old laws were ancient and binding, and he was a king who respected the weight of blood. But he felt the air changing. He felt the static of a coming storm. The enforcers reached the edge of the forbidden outlands, a dense, jagged forest where the trees grew black and the rogues hunted in the dark. With a final, mocking laugh, they threw her body over a steep embankment. Boudicca tumbled through the briars and the sharp, frozen dirt, her body a rag doll until she hit the bottom of a shallow ravine. "Sleep well, runt," one of the enforcers shouted from above. "Try not to scream too loud when the scavengers start on your toes." They turned and walked away, their laughter fading into the distance, replaced by the howling of the winter wind. Boudicca lay in the dirt, her navy dress shredded, her skin a map of bruises and cuts. The cold should have been her end. The blood loss should have put her to sleep. She lay there, staring at the moon through the skeletal branches of the trees, her breathing shallow and ragged. "I am nothing," she thought, the words a rhythmic chant in her mind. "I am a defect. I am a stain." But then the pain changed. It was no longer the sharp agony of the rejection or the dull throb of the beating. It was a heat, deep within the marrow of her bones, the place where the Iceni bloodline had been suppressed for 2 decades. The seal didn't just crack. It disintegrated. The rejection had been the final hammer blow needed to break the ancient, poisonous magic that had kept her wolfless. The pain became a pressure. It felt as though a star were trying to be born inside her ribcage. Thump. Her heart didn't beat. It pulsed with a heavy, metallic resonance that shook the ground beneath her. "No more," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. It wasn't her voice. It was ancient. It was deep. It was furious. Boudicca's eyes snapped open. The violet was gone, replaced by a swirling, blinding silver that illuminated the dark ravine like a flare. A sickening crack echoed through the forest. Her arm, the one Valdis had stepped on, snapped and began to elongate. Her ribs began to shift, expanding with a wet, grinding sound of bone sliding against bone. Boudicca didn't scream this time. She couldn't. Her throat was reforming, her vocal cords thickening into something capable of a roar that could shatter stone. She rolled onto her hands and knees, the dirt flying as her fingernails lengthened into obsidian claws that tore through the frozen earth. Her pale skin began to itch, a white-hot fire racing across her back as fur, shimmering, pure silver fur, burst through the pores. The pressure in her chest became unbearable. It was the weight of 20 years of silence. The weight of every floor she had scrubbed. The weight of every foot that had ground her face into the mud. The air around her began to hum with ozone. The sleet turned to steam as it hit her radiating skin. Boudicca Iceni was gone. Something ancient, something that had waited 3,000 years for a reckoning, was clawing its way out of the girl in the dirt. From the shadows of the trees, a lone wolf, a scout from the northern territories, watched in paralyzed terror. He didn't see an Omega dying. He saw a silver light so bright it blinded him, and heard a sound that made his inner beast drop to its knees in total, absolute submission. The silver wolf was awake, and the world was about to burn. The Forbidden Outlands had always been a place where sound went to die, but tonight the silence was unnatural. It was a vacuum, a bated breath held by the earth itself. In the center of the dark ravine, the girl who had been Boudicca Iceni was disappearing, consumed by a light that didn't belong to the physical world. The suppression spell, a complex web of ancient lunar magic and poisonous wolf's bane that had been woven into her soul as an infant, didn't just unravel. It detonated. For 20 years, her power had been a coiled spring, compressed further by every floor she scrubbed and every blow she took. Ragnar's rejection hadn't just broken her heart. It had been the final crushing weight that caused the spring to snap back with lethal force. Boudicca felt the first true wave of her primordial power hit her like a tidal wave of molten silver. It was agony, a white-hot flaying of her consciousness, but it was accompanied by a terrifying ecstasy. For the first time in 2 decades, the void inside her was gone. In its place was a presence so vast, so ancient, that it made her human mind feel like a flickering candle in a hurricane. Finally, the presence roared. It wasn't a voice of words, but of blood and instinct. Finally we rise. Her bones didn't just crack, they sang. The wet, rhythmic grinding of her skeleton rearranging was the only sound in the forest. Her spine elongated, the vertebrae clicking into place with the precision of a master-crafted machine. Her shoulders broadened, muscles knitting together with the density of steel cable. Her skin, once pale and bruised, began to shimmer. Shimmering pure white fur, each strand tipped with a translucent glow like moonlight reflected on fresh ice, erupted from her pores. This was no ordinary shift. Most first shifts resulted in a wolf the size of a large hound, a messy and ungainly transition. But Boudicca was not shifting into a wolf. She was reclaiming a bloodline. He kept growing. 6 feet at the shoulder. 6.5. 7. When the light finally subsided, the ravine was occupied by a beast of myth. The silver wolf stood nearly as tall as a warhorse, her massive paws digging deep furrows into the frozen earth. Her coat was a blinding, iridescent silver that seemed to generate its own light, casting long, sharp shadows against the blackened trees. Her tail was a thick, majestic plume, and her ears were tufted like a lynx's, twitching with the sudden influx of 1,000 sensory inputs. Boudicca, or rather the consciousness that was now a perfect merger of girl and beast, opened her eyes. They were no longer violet. They were a brilliant, electric blue that burned with the intensity of a dying star. She tasted the air. She could smell the fear of the rodents a mile away. She could hear the rhythmic thrum of the Earth's core. But most importantly, she could feel the jagged, broken remnants of the bond Ragnar had tried to sever. It didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a trail. The forest had gone deathly quiet. The insects had stopped their chirping. The nocturnal birds had frozen on their branches. The very wind seemed to have died in respect. The silver wolf lowered her massive head, her nostrils flaring as she took her first breath as a sovereign. Then she planted her paws, each one the size of a man's chest, and tipped her head back toward the blood-red moon. The howl that tore from her throat was not a sound. It was a physical force. It began as a low, vibrating rumble that shook the pebbles in the ravine, then ascended into a high, haunting crystalline note that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the sky. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a proclamation. Asterisk, I am here. I am the end. I am the beginning. Asterisk. The sound traveled through the forbidden outlands, over the jagged peaks of the northern territories, and into every pack house within 100 miles. In the great hall of the Bloodmoon Pack, the harvest moon feast was in full swing. Ragnar sat on his obsidian throne, a goblet of wine in his hand, his face a mask of bored indifference as he listened to Valdis's prattle. Then the sound hit. The wine in the glasses began to ripple. The heavy iron chandeliers swayed. Then the howl crashed through the hall like a physical wave. It was a sound none of them had heard in 3,000 years, yet every wolf in the room recognized it in their DNA. It was the call of the primordial Alpha. Suddenly the music died. 500 wolves, warriors, betas and alphas alike, found their bodies betraying them. Their inner beasts didn't just whimpering, they dropped. Across the hall, men and women fell to their knees, their heads bowing toward the direction of the forest in a reflex of total abject submission. Valdis shrieked as she hit the floor, her face pressed against the stone she had made Boudicca scrub. What is that? What is happening? Ragnar stood, his face turning the color of ash. His own wolf, a creature of pure aggression and pride, was cowering in the back of his mind, whining in terror. He gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles white as he looked toward the windows. The scent hit him a second later. It was the scent he had caught for a heartbeat on the dais, the milk and honey that had confused him. But now it was amplified 1,000 times. It was ozone. It was ancient snow. It was the scent of a queen. No, Ragnar whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in his life. He remembered the way she had looked on her knees. He remembered the jagged patch of hair Valdis had cut. He remembered the look of absolute soul-shattering agony in her violet eyes when he had said the words of rejection. He had called her a defect. He had called her a stain. The realization hit him like a broadside from a warship. The Wolfless girl hadn't been broken. She had been a sleeping goddess, and he had just spent the last hour trying to destroy her. Ragnar, the beta asked from the floor, his voice shaking. Is that the silver wolf? Ragnar didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at his hand, the hand that had shoved her chin away in disgust. It was shaking. Across the hall, near the pillars of the entrance, Warlord King Bleda Attila was the only one who hadn't fallen to his knees. He stood tall, his black trench coat billowing in the sudden draft, a small dark smile playing on his lips. He looked out toward the forest, his eyes reflecting the silver light that was beginning to bleed over the horizon. "The Iceni have returned," Bleda murmured, his voice filled with an ancient, dangerous awe. In the forest, the silver wolf finished her howl. She looked back toward the Bloodmoon Pack house, her electric blue eyes narrowed. He could feel them. She could feel their fear, their submission, and Ragnar's sudden, pathetic regret. She didn't run back to them. She didn't seek their forgiveness. Instead, she turned her massive body toward the north, toward the jagged mountains and the king who had watched her with eyes like the void. She moved, and it was a blur of silver lightning. With a single leap, she cleared the ravine, her paws barely touching the earth as she began to run. For the first time in 20 years, Boudicca Iceni was not hauling water. She was not scrubbing floors. She was hunting. The roar of the silver wolf still vibrated in the air, a physical hum that seemed to have permanently altered the frequency of the night. In the great hall of the Bloodmoon Pack, the silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of glass crunching underfoot as Alpha Ragnar stood paralyzed. But outside, in the freezing dark of the Forbidden Outlands, the world was moving with lethal precision. Warlord King Bleda Attila did not wait for the permission of a lesser alpha. While the rest of the court remained on their knees, trapped in a trance of genetic submission, Bleda had already pivoted toward the exit. His heavy black trench coat snapped like a whip behind him, his boots thundering against the stone. "To the horses," Bleda commanded, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that cut through the haze of the hall. "Why, King?" one of his onyx guard whispered, moving in a blur to stay at his side. "That sound, it was a primordial. You can't go out there without a full battalion. If that beast is feral." "It isn't a beast," Bleda interrupted, his eyes gleaming like polished obsidian. "It is an Iceni. The Silver Queen has returned. And I will not have her first night of freedom stained by the filth of this pack." Bleda was a scholar of the old ways, a man who had spent decades scouring ancient ruins and crumbling scrolls for the truth of their kind. He knew the prophecy of the Argentum line. He knew that the silver wolves were the conduits of the moon goddess's raw power, thought to have been purged by the chain of submission centuries ago. He had sensed the anomaly in the girl the moment he entered the hall. The way the shadows seemed to cling to her, the way the air shimmered around her matted hair. He had watched the rejection with a simmering fury, waiting for the catalyst he knew was coming. They mounted their war stallions, massive iron-shod beasts bred for the rugged northern terrain, and galloped into the forest. The trail was easy to follow. A path of scorched earth and splintered trees marked the silver wolf's passage. The ozone scent was so strong it made the horses' manes stand on end. Deep in the ravine, 3 Bloodmoon warriors, enforcers who had been sent by Ragnar to confirm that the defect had succumbed to the cold, were finding out the true meaning of terror. They were huddled against a jagged rock wall, their own wolves cowering so deeply within them that they had lost the ability to shift. Standing 10 feet away from them was a creature from their most violent nightmares. The silver wolf was a monolith of iridescent fur and electric blue light. Her head was lowered, a low tectonic growl rumbling from a chest broad enough to crush a carriage. Every time she breathed, a frost mist curled from her jowls, shimmering with silver sparks. She hadn't attacked them yet. She was simply existing, her mere presence forcing the air out of their lungs. "Please," one of the warriors whimpered, his bladder letting go in a pathetic display of cowardice. "Budi, please. We were just following orders." The silver wolf's eyes narrowed. The girl's memories, the kicks to the ribs, the hair sheared off with a skinning knife, surged through the beast's mind like venom. She took a step forward, the ground cracking beneath her massive paw. "Stand down." The command didn't come from the warriors. Bleda Attila rode into the clearing, his onyx guard fan folding out behind him, weapons drawn but lowered. He dismounted before his horse had even fully stopped, his boots sinking into the blood-stained snow. "Back away from her," Bleda ordered the Bloodmoon warriors. He didn't look at them. His eyes were locked onto the silver wolf. The three enforcers scrambled away, crawling on their hands and knees through the briars, desperate to put distance between themselves and the monster. They ran back toward the pack house, their screams echoing through the trees. Bleda turned his full attention to the beast. His guards moved to form a perimeter, their bone-white masks eerie in the silver glow. "Pi King, be careful," the guard captain warned. "She is in the blood frenzy of a first shift." Bleda ignored him. He took a step toward the silver wolf. She let out a roar that sent a shockwave through the clearing, the sheer pressure of it knocking two of the guards back a step. She bared canines the size of daggers, her iridescent fur bristling until she looked like a mountain of needles. Bleda didn't draw a weapon. He didn't growl. He didn't try to exert alpha dominance. Instead, he did something that made his own men gasp. He stopped 5 feet from her and dropped to one knee. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck, the ultimate sign of respect among shifters. "Iceni," Bleda said, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of a mountain. "I am Bleda Attila, Warlord King of the Northern Territories. I have looked for your kind in every shadow of this world." The silver wolf paused. The growl died down into a confused hum. She tilted her massive head, her electric blue eyes scanning the man before her. She saw no fear in him. She saw no disgust. She saw a king recognizing a queen. "The Bloodmoon Pack has forfeited their right to you," Bleda continued, looking up into her glowing eyes. "They called you nothing. They called you a stain. But I see you. I claim you under the royal protection of the North. No alpha, no court, and no god will touch you while I draw breath." The silver wolf stepped closer. She could have crushed his skull with a single snap of her jaws. She sniffed the air around him, scenting sandalwood, cold iron, and a deep, ancient honor. Slowly the tension left her massive frame. The iridescent glow began to fade, the electric blue of her eyes softening. She lowered her head, her wet nose touching Bleda's shoulder in a gesture of acceptance. Then the collapse came. 20 years of suppression, followed by a cataclysmic transformation and a soul-shattering rejection, finally took their toll. The silver wolf shimmered. Her form blurred and contracted, the sound of snapping bones returning as she shrunk back into a human shape. Bleda moved with the speed of a predator. Before she could hit the frozen dirt, he caught her. Boudicca lay in his arms, her navy dress in tatters, her skin pearlescent and shivering. She was unconscious, her face pale as death, but the violet of her closed eyes seemed to pulse with a faint, lingering silver light. "Pi King." A thunder of hooves approached from the direction of the pack house. Alpha Ragnar Fenrir burst into the clearing, followed by a dozen of his elite warriors. He looked frantic, his storm-gray eyes wild with a mixture of possessiveness and panic. He skidded to a halt, seeing Bleda holding the naked, unconscious girl wrapped in the warlord's own black trench coat. "Attila!" Ragnar roared, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword. "Put her down. That is a member of the Bloodmoon Pack. She is my mate." Bleda turned slowly. The heat radiating from him was so intense the snow began to melt in a circle around his boots. He looked at Ragnar with a contempt so profound it was more insulting than a blow to the face. "Your mate." Bleda's voice was a low, dangerous purr. "I seem to recall the entire northern court witnessing you reject her. I heard the ritual words, Ragnar. I felt the bond shatter. You called her a defect. You called her a stain. You threw her into the snow to die. I didn't know." Ragnar shouted, his pride desperate to find a foothold. The bond was confused. Now that she has shifted, the rejection is null. "She is my Luna." "She is an Iceni," Bleda corrected, his voice rising until it cracked like a whip. "And by the old laws you so love to quote, a banished wolf claimed by a king belongs to the crown. She owes you nothing but the blood she will eventually take from your veins." Ragnar stepped forward, his wolf pushing to the surface, his eyes turning a feral gray. "I will not let you take her." The 12 onyx guards leveled their crossbows and drew their obsidian blades in a single synchronized motion. The air in the clearing became a powder keg. "Try it, Alpha," Bleda said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I have wanted an excuse to raise this pack house for a decade. Give me one today. I will kill you, I will salt your earth, and I will make Valdis scrub the blood from my boots before I execute her too." Ragnar froze. He looked at Bleda's elite guard, then back at the king. He realized with a sinking horror that he was outmatched. Bleda wasn't just an alpha. He was a warlord who had united the warring tribes. "This isn't over," Ragnar hissed, though he took a step back. "It was over the moment you let her scrub your floors, Ragnar," Bleda said. He turned his back on the alpha, the ultimate insult, and carried Boudicca toward his horse. He mounted with her cradled against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He could feel the heat still radiating from her skin, the hum of the silver wolf quiet but present. "We ride for the citadel," Bleda commanded. They galloped out of the forbidden outlands, leaving Ragnar standing in the dirt, surrounded by the ruins of his own arrogance. The journey to the north was a blur of wind and snow. Bleda kept Boudicca wrapped tight, his own body heat acting as an anchor for her flickering consciousness. He looked down at her pale face, at the jagged hair, and at the raw knuckles. "Sleep, little queen," he whispered into the wind. "When you wake, the world will finally be at your feet." By the time the first light of dawn touched the jagged spires of the war citadel, a fortress carved into the side of a glacier, the news had already begun to spread across the continent. The defective Omega was gone. The silver wolf had been claimed by the king. And the reckoning had only just begun. The first thing Boudicca realized was that the air did not bite. For 20 years her lungs had been accustomed to the stale, freezing drafts of the Bloodmoon Pack house, air that smelled of damp stone, old tallow, and the oppressive musk of wolves who wanted her to know her place. This air was different. It was warm, carrying the faint, clean scent of sandalwood, medicinal herbs and wood smoke. She opened her eyes and the world did not look like a basement. Instead of a cracked ceiling of cobwebs, she stared up at an expansive vaulted chamber of polished dark stone. Sunlight, pale but steady, filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a jagged snow-capped mountain range she didn't recognize. Boudicca tried to sit up, but a sharp phantom ache flared in her joints, the lingering memory of her bones liquefying and reforming. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Easy," a voice soothed. It was deep, like the vibration of a cello, steady and devoid of the jagged edge of a threat. "Your bones are still knitting together. The first shift of a sovereign is taxing." Boudicca scrambled backward, her breath hitching as she pressed her back against a plush velvet headboard. She realized then that she was lying on a bed that felt like a cloud, covered in silk sheets so fine they felt like water against her skin. She was no longer wearing the shredded rags of her navy dress. Instead, she was clad in a soft, white linen tunic that felt like a caress against her healing skin. Sitting in a heavy leather armchair by the roaring hearth was the man from the forest. Warlord King Bleda Attila. He had traded his heavy war furs for a simple charcoal sweater, looking less like a titan of the battlefield and more like a man, though the faint silver scars running down the side of his neck hinted at a violent past. He didn't move toward her, sensing her panic. He remained still, his dark eyes watching her with a respectful distance that made the air feel safe rather than suffocating. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. It was no longer the thin, reedy voice of a servant. It had a resonance to it, a low hum of power that vibrated in her chest. "You are in the war citadel of the north," Bleda said. "My home. And for as long as you wish it to be yours." Boudicca looked at her hands. They were human again, but they weren't the hands she remembered. The calluses from 20 years of scrubbing were fading, replaced by a pearlescent sheen on her skin. Her fingernails were slightly longer, harder, looking more like obsidian than bone. "I remember the forest," she said, her memories returning in jagged, terrifying flashes. The pain of Ragnar's rejection, the explosion of silver light, and the way the 3 Blood Moon warriors had looked at her, as if she were a god of death. "I hurt them. I shifted." "You did more than shift, Boudicca," Bleda said, standing up slowly. He poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher and brought it to her, his movements telegraphing his actions so as not to startle her. "You ended a 3,000-year silence." He sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a careful distance. "The Bloodmoon Pack told you that you were a defect. They told you that you were an omega who lacked a wolf. They told you that you were nothing. Because I was," she said, her voice trembling. "I was 20 years old. I never heard my wolf. I never felt the heat." "You were suppressed," Bleda said firmly, his eyes darkening with a flash of ancient anger, not at her but for her. "You were never an omega, Boudicca. You are an Iceni, the most powerful bloodline that ever existed. And they tried to erase you." Boudicca felt the room spin. "The Iceni? I was told my mother was a human, that she died in a rogue raid." "Lies," Bleda said softly. "Your mother was Andraste Iceni, the last known silver wolf. She wasn't killed by rogues. She was hunted by the Chain of Submission, a faction of fanatics who believe that the power of the primordials is too dangerous for the world to hold. He reached into his pocket and produced a silver locket, dangled it from his finger. It was engraved with a crescent moon intersected by a lightning bolt. This was hidden from you by the former Alpha of the Bloodmoon. He knew what you were. He was terrified of you. Boudicca took the locket, her thumb tracing the lightning bolt. A spark of electricity jumped from the metal to her skin, making her heart stutter. Before your mother died, Bleda explained, she cast a suppression spell on you. She wove ancient lunar magic and small, constant doses of wolf's bane into your life to keep your beast in a coma. It wasn't a punishment, Boudicca. It was protection. She knew that if the chain found a silver wolf pup, they would execute you before you could grow into your power. Your wolflessness was a shroud. Boudicca stared at him, the weight of 20 years of shame beginning to lift, replaced by a terrifying new identity. So, I'm not broken. You are a nuclear weapon that has just been armed, Bleda said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The rejection from Ragnar, the sheer emotional trauma of it, acted as a catalyst. It burned the poison out of your system and shattered the seals your mother placed on your marrow. You are a sovereign, Boudicca. You are a primordial alpha who can command submission from any wolf on this continent with a single growl. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Citadel's training grounds where hundreds of warriors were practicing with steel and bone. The Silver Wolves were the original ruling class. Their wolves are not bound by the hierarchy of the pack. They are conduits of the moon goddess's raw power. Boudicca looked at her reflection in the dark stone of the wall. The girl she saw was pale, her blonde hair still jagged where Valdis had cut it, but her eyes, her violet eyes, were now swirled with flecks of gold. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" Bleda turned back to her. The sunlight caught the hard planes of his face, and for a moment, Boudicca felt a different kind of pull, not the desperate, sickly need to please she had felt with Ragnar, but a hum of electricity. A challenge. "The chain of submission is still out there," Bleda said. "And Ragnar, his pride is wounded. He will try to claim you back now that he knows you are a legend and not a servant. He humiliated you. He looked at you like you were garbage." "I know," Boudicca whispered, her fingers curling into the silk sheets until they threatened to tear. "He will regret that for the rest of his miserable life." Bleda smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his harsh face. "I can teach you. I can show you how to harness the storm inside you. I can help you take your rightful place, but you have to trust me." Boudicca looked at his hand, large, calloused, and capable of ending 1,000 lives. He thought of the kitchens. She thought of the lye soap that had cracked her knuckles. She thought of the way the Bloodmoon Pack had laughed while she was dragged into the snow. No more, the silver wolf growled in the back of her mind. No more kneeling. She reached out and took Bleda's hand. His skin was hot against hers, sending a jolt of energy through her arm that made her breath hitch. "Teach me," she said, her voice ringing like a bell. "Teach me how to make them pay." Bleda pulled her to her feet. "First," he said, walking her toward a massive walk-in closet filled with silks and furs that still had the tags of the finest northern weavers. "We need to get you dressed. The Council of Elders has arrived. They felt the energy surge when you shifted, and they are coming to see if the rumors of the Iceni are true. Boudicca paled. The council? They're the ones who govern all shifter laws. They're ruthless. You're with me now, Bleda said, his hand lingering on the doorframe. He paused, his expression turning intense. But Boudicca, there's one thing you need to know. The Silver Wolf is not just a warrior. According to the prophecy, she is destined to choose a mate who will either unite the warring kingdoms or destroy them all. He stepped closer, his scent of sandalwood and winter rain enveloping her. Ragnar rejected you. The bond is snapped. But nature abhors a vacuum. Your wolf will be seeking a new mate soon. And when the heat hits you, every unmated alpha on the continent will smell it. He leaned down, his eyes turning into pits of dark void. Including me. Boudicca swallowed hard, her heart racing not with fear, but with a burgeoning violent desire. What happens then? Bleda's eyes darkened, a low collective growl starting in his chest that made her toes curl against the stone floor. Then, little wolf, the real game begins. The sirens of the citadel began to wail, a sudden red light flashing in the hallway. Bleda tapped an earpiece he was wearing. Report. Perimeter breach, my king. A frantic voice crackled over the line. It's the Bloodmoon Pack. They've surrounded the southern gate. Alpha Ragnar is demanding an audience. He claims we kidnapped his Luna. Bleda's jaw tightened. He looked at Boudicca, expecting to see the terrified servant of the Blood Moon. Instead, he saw a queen. Boudicca grabbed a long black silk robe and wrapped it around herself. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger that made her eyes glow with an incandescent silver. Let him in, Boudicca said, her voice surprising even herself. Bleda raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Boudicca walked to the mirror, smoothing her jagged hair. Her reflection looked different, sharper, deadlier. He wants to see his Luna, she said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. Let him see what he threw away. The heavy iron gates of the northern citadel groaned as they were forced open, admitting a blast of frigid air and the scent of desperate possessive aggression. Alpha Ragnar Fenrir did not enter as a guest, he entered as a claimant. He was flanked by his beta and a dozen of his elite Blood Moon warriors, all of whom looked disheveled, their eyes rimmed with red from a sleepless, frantic journey through the mountain passes. Ragnar stopped dead in the center of the courtyard, his breath hitching as he looked up at the balcony. There stood Boudicca. She was no longer wearing the oversized rags or the maid's uniform of a servant. She wore a high-collared gown of midnight blue velvet that highlighted the newfound strength in her posture. Her pale blonde hair was braided back like a valkyrie, exposing the elegant curve of her neck. To Ragnar, who had only ever seen her covered in grime and cowering in the shadows, she looked like a queen. Boudicca, Ragnar breathed, taking a reflexive step forward, his storm-gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a sudden toxic lust. That's close enough, Fenrir, Warlord Bleda warned, stepping out from the shadows of the balcony to stand beside her, his presence a dark, protective wall. Ragnar's gaze snapped to the warlord, hatred burning in his eyes. You stole her, he spat, his voice shaking with the pressure of his own ego. You took advantage of a chaotic situation to kidnap my mate. Ex-mate, Boudicca corrected. Her voice was calm, but it carried through the courtyard with a crystal clarity that silenced the murmuring guards. Ragnar looked back at her, his expression shifting into a pleading, manipulative mask. Boudicca, please, you have to understand. I was under pressure. The pack. They expect strength. When I didn't sense your wolf, I thought you were sick. I did it to protect the pack. You did it to protect your pride, Boudicca said, descending the stone stairs toward him, her movements fluid and predatory. You didn't just reject me, Ragnar. You mocked me. You let Valdis stomp on my hands. You threw me into the snow to die. Do not rewrite history just because you realized I have value now. Ragnar's face contorted, his temper fraying as the visiting dignitaries and the warlord's guard watched his humiliation. It was a mistake, he roared. The rejection wasn't valid because you hadn't shifted. The bond wasn't fully formed, so it couldn't be fully broken. You are still the Luna of the Blood Moon. He turned to the Council of Elders, who had emerged from the shadows like specters in gray cloaks. I invoke the law of first rights, Ragnar announced, his voice booming with a desperate authority. If the bond is disputed, ancient law dictates a trial by blood. A rejected mate can be reclaimed if the rejecter wins a trial by combat against the rejected. A low murmur of shock rippled through the assembled crowd. A trial of blood was an ancient, brutal tradition. Ragnar looked at Warlord Bleda, a cruel, predatory grin returning to his face. He was one of the strongest fighters in the north, and he expected Boudicca to hide behind a champion, likely the warlord himself. I accept, Ragnar said immediately, his eyes locked on Bleda. I will fight for what is mine. Bleda began to step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his obsidian blade, his face a mask of lethal intent. I will rip him apart, the warlord growled. No, Boudicca said. The courtyard went deathly silent. Bleda stopped, looking at her in surprise. Boudicca, he is a trained killer, he whispered. You shifted for the first time yesterday. Boudicca looked at Ragnar, seeing the smugness in his eyes. He thought this was a formality. He thought he would fight Bleda, or perhaps the warlord would refuse to risk a war and he would get his prize back. He didn't see her as a threat. He still saw her as a trophy to be won. If I let you fight for me, Boudicca whispered to Bleda, I will always be the weak omega in their eyes. I will always be the girl who needs saving. She turned to the council, her chin held high, her eyes beginning to swirl with incandescent silver light. I choose no champion, she announced, her voice ringing across the stones. I will fight him myself. Ragnar laughed. It was a genuine, incredulous sound of a man who believed the world was still as it had been 48 hours ago. You don't even know how to retract your claws properly. I won't fight you, Boudicca. I might break you. Then you forfeit, she said coldly. Ragnar's smile vanished. Fine. I'll beat you into submission, drag you back to the pack house and teach you your place. The council elder Michael nodded solemnly. The challenge is issued and accepted. At dawn in the circle of ice. To the yield or to the death. The circle of ice was an ancient amphitheater carved into the surrounding cliffs, its floor a frozen lake thick enough to hold the weight of shifting behemoths. As the sun began to crest the peaks, casting a blood-red glow across the ice, the stands were filled with members of both packs and the council. Boudicca stood on the northern side of the circle. She wore a simple tactical suit Bleda had provided, flexible, durable black fabric that allowed for a full shift. She was barefoot on the ice, but she didn't feel the cold. The fire of the Iceni bloodline was burning too hot. On the southern side, Ragnar stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso of hard muscle and old scars. He looked confident, stretching his neck and winking at his warriors. Rules of engagement. Elder Michael's voice boomed over the valley. No weapons, no external interference. Shift is permitted. The fight ends when one wolf submits, is unconscious, or is dead. Bleda stood at the edge of the barrier, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. Remember, he projected to Boudicca's hearing. He is strong, but he is arrogant. He fights with anger. You fight with instinct. Use his weight against him. Begin. Ragnar didn't shift immediately. He wanted to humiliate her in human form first. He charged across the ice with terrifying speed, aiming a backhand slap at her face. A disrespectful move meant to show she wasn't worth a real blow. Boudicca didn't block it. She ducked. Her movement was fluid, faster than any wolf he had ever trained. As Ragnar's hand whizzed through the empty air, she drove her fist into his solar plexus. It wasn't a trained punch. It was raw, primordial power. Oof. The air left Ragnar's lungs. He skidded backward on the ice, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with a dawning terror. You called me weak, Boudicca taunted, bouncing on the balls of her feet as the silver light in her eyes intensified. You called me defective. Nothing. A stain. Ragnar's face turned purple with rage. You little witch, he roared. His body exploded into motion. Bones cracked and reshaped in a blur of fur and muscle. In seconds, a massive midnight black wolf stood on the ice. A prime alpha specimen, snarling with saliva dripping from his jaws. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, aiming directly for her throat. Boudicca closed her eyes for a split second. Let's go, she whispered to the beast within. With pleasure, the silver wolf answered. A flash of blinding silver light erupted from her body, so bright the spectators had to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the silver wolf stood on the ice. She was bigger than Ragnar, her fur looking like liquid mercury. Ragnar collided with her, but it was like running into a mountain. Boudicca didn't budge. She took the impact, then snapped her massive jaws onto his shoulder. Ragnar yelped, thrashing wildly as he realized the runt he had banished was an apex predator he could never hope to tame. The crowd erupted. For the first time in history, the North was watching an alpha realize he had not just miscalculated. He had invited his own destruction. The circle of ice was no longer a stage. It was an altar. Above, the harvest moon hung bloated and crimson, bleeding its light onto the frozen lake. The air was so cold it crystallized the breath of the 500 wolves watching from the stone tiers, but the heat radiating from the center of the ring was enough to make the ice groan and shift. Ragnar Fenrir, the once indomitable alpha of the Bloodmoon Pack, was no longer a man. He was a 400-pound engine of midnight fur and predatory rage. He lunged again, his claws shrieking against the ice as he sought purchase. He had spent his life believing that strength was a matter of muscle and cruelty, and he threw every ounce of that belief into a jagged, desperate strike aimed at the silver wolf's flank. Boudicca didn't flinch. In the back of her mind, the memories of the servant girl, the one who had flinched at the sound of a raised voice, were being incinerated. In their place, something ancient and tactical had taken root. This was the Iceni bloodline, a lineage of warrior queens who hadn't just led packs. They had commanded the elements. As Ragnar's massive black form hurtled toward her, Boudicca didn't meet him head-on. She pivoted on a single paw with a grace that defied her size, her silver coat shimmering like a streak of lightning. She let his momentum carry him past her, then lashed out with a hind leg. Frick! The sound of Ragnar's ribs snapping echoed off the cliff walls. The black wolf was sent skidding across the ice, his claws digging frantic furrows into the frozen surface as he struggled to stop his momentum. He scrambled to his feet, a low wet wheeze coming from his chest, but his eyes were no longer those of a conqueror. They were the eyes of a cornered animal realizing for the first time that it was no longer the apex predator. Boudicca didn't give him time to recover. She stalked forward, her massive paws thudding rhythmically against the ice. She wasn't just fighting, she was hunting. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion, her electric blue eyes locked onto his jugular. Ragnar let out a desperate guttural roar and lunged one last time, a suicide charge meant to catch her throat. Boudicca met him halfway. She reared up on her hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet tall, and caught his midsection in her massive forepaws. With a display of raw, primordial strength that made the Council of Elders stand in unison, she slammed Ragnar onto his back. The ice beneath him splintered, a web of cracks radiating outward from the point of impact. Before he could even draw breath to snarl, Boudicca was on him. She pinned his shoulders with her weight, her massive silver head descending until her fangs were grazing the pulsing vein in his neck. A low, tectonic growl rumbled from her chest, a sound so powerful it forced the alphas in the stands to bow their heads in sympathetic terror. It was the sound of a sovereign demanding the ultimate price. Ragnar thrashed for a moment, his paws clawing uselessly at her silver fur, but the pressure on his throat increased. He could feel her power, a cold, celestial fire that made his own wolf cower in the darkest corners of his mind. The black wolf's eyes rolled back, his tail tucked. The fight was over. Boudicca shifted. The transition was no longer a cataclysm of pain. It was a fluid, controlled unraveling of magic. Within seconds the silver wolf was gone, and Boudicca stood on the ice in her black tactical gear, her blonde hair whipped by the mountain wind. She didn't look tired. She looked descended. Ragnar shifted back a moment later, his naked body bruised and broken against the ice. He coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and frost, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself up. He looked up at the girl who had cleaned his floors, and for the first time in 20 years he truly saw her. Boudicca stepped onto his chest, her heel pressing into the center of his sternum, forcing him back down. "Look at me, Ragnar," she commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of the mountain. Ragnar's storm-gray eyes were clouded with agony and shame. He looked around the amphitheater, at his warriors who were staring in stunned silence, at Valdis who was cowering behind a pillar, and finally at Warlord Bleda, who was watching from the edge of the circle with a pride so intense it was visible. "You called me a defect," Boudicca said, her voice cutting through the wind like a razor. "You called me a stain on the goddess's design. You told the world I was nothing. She leaned down, her face inches from his. Her eyes flashed silver, a warning of the monster that still paced behind her ribs. Beg, she whispered. Ragnar's jaw worked, his pride struggling against the reality of his defeat. Beg for mercy from the defective Omega you threw into the snow, Boudicca repeated, her voice hardening. Beg, or I will let my wolf finish what you started in the forest. A sob broke from Ragnar's throat, a sound of total, absolute humiliation. He was an alpha who had ruled with an iron fist, and now he was a broken man on a sheet of ice. Please, he rasped, the word barely audible. Please. Mercy. The silence that followed was deafening. The Bloodmoon Pack watched their leader crumble, their own sense of identity shattering along with his. Boudicca stood tall, removing her foot from his chest. She didn't look down on him with hatred anymore. She looked at him with the cold indifference of a god. I will not take your life, she announced to the council. To kill you would be an act of mercy you do not deserve. Instead, I pass judgment. She turned to Elder Michael, who nodded for her to continue. Ragnar Fenrir is hereby stripped of his title and his pack, Boudicca declared. He is banished from the northern territories. He will leave this circle as a lone wolf. No pack to protect him, no title to shield him, and no mate to anchor him. If he is seen on these lands after the sun sets, he is to be hunted like the cur he is. Ragnar let out a strangled cry. For a wolf, banishment was a fate worse than death. To be a lone wolf was to be a ghost, a creature without a soul, destined to wander until the cold or the rogues finally claimed him. Guards, Bleda's voice boomed from the sidelines. Escort the exile to the border. Strip him of his furs. He leaves with nothing, just as he gave to her. 2 onyx guards stepped into the circle, grabbing Ragnar by the arms. He didn't fight back. He looked like a man who had already died. As they dragged him past Boudicca, he looked at her one last time, searching for a spark of the girl who had loved him from the shadows. He found nothing but the silver frost of the Iceni. As the gates of the amphitheater closed behind the fallen Alpha, the crowd remained in a state of shock. The power dynamic of the North had been upended in a single hour. Bleda descended from the stands, his black coat billowing. He walked across the ice, stopping inches from Boudicca. He didn't say a word. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of her blonde hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering on her jawline. His eyes were no longer pits of void. They were burning with a dark, magnetic heat. He had watched her dominate a high alpha, had watched her wield her power with the precision of a queen, and the attraction between them had moved from a spark to an inferno. You did well, little wolf, Bleda whispered. Boudicca looked up at him, her chest still heaving from the fight. I'm not a little wolf, Bleda. Bleda's dark smile returned, more dangerous than ever. I know. You are the storm. And I think it's time the world learned how to survive you. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin, and led her out of the circle. Behind them, the harvest moon was sinking, but for Boudicca Iceni, the sun was finally beginning to rise. The aftermath of the trial had left the war citadel in a state of precarious silence. While the Bloodmoon warriors had retreated like beaten curs and the common folk whispered of miracles, the air around the fortress grew heavy with a different kind of tension. It was the smell of ozone and old, rotting incense, the scent of the chain of submission. Boudicca stood on the high battlements of the citadel, her black silk robe fluttering in the biting wind. Beside her, Bleda was a shadow against the starlight, his hand resting on the stone parapet. They hadn't spoken for an hour, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, a bridge of heat and recognition that had only grown stronger since she had stepped out of the circle of ice. "They won't wait for morning," Bleda said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the stone itself. "The chain?" Boudicca asked, her violet eyes scanning the dark treeline below. "You think they'll risk attacking a royal citadel? To them you are an existential threat, Boudicca. A silver wolf is a crack in the foundation of everything they've built. For 3,000 years, they have enforced a hierarchy based on the natural dominance of alphas. You are the living proof that their hierarchy is a lie." As if summoned by his words, a series of muffled thuds echoed from the southern perimeter. Then a scream tore through the night, followed by the clanging of the citadel's alarm bells. From the darkness of the forest, 100 warriors emerged. They weren't dressed in the furs of the northern packs. They wore bone-white leather and masks carved into the likeness of snarling wolves with their muzzles sewn shut. At their head rode a woman on a massive gray stallion, Elder Morana, the highest-ranking member of the council's fanatical wing. "Bring down the walls." Morana's voice shrieked, amplified by magic. "Purge the abomination. Restore the divine order." The attack was a surgical strike. The chain's warriors used specialized silver-tipped grappling hooks to scale the outer walls, while their mages unleashed bursts of concentrated moonlight that shattered the iron gates. "Stay behind the line," Bleda commanded, drawing his obsidian broadsword as his onyx guards surged forward to meet the breach. "No," Boudicca said. She stepped toward the edge of the battlement. The heat in her chest was no longer a simmer. It was a volcanic eruption. The silver wolf within her wasn't just pacing. She was screaming for the blood of those who had hunted her mother. As the first wave of fanatics reached the top of the wall, Boudicca didn't shift. Not fully. Instead of the agonizing snap of bones, a blinding silver light erupted from her skin. Her body elongated slightly, her muscles rippling with a density that defied human biology. Her fingernails didn't turn to claws. They became obsidian talons that hummed with electric energy. Her blonde hair flared white-hot, flowing around her like a halo of solar fire. She had achieved the impossible, the merger. She was the human and the beast simultaneously, a hybrid form of primordial grace and lethal power. "The abomination!" Morana screamed from below, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing figure on the wall. "Kill it, before it breeds." Boudicca didn't wait. She leaped from the 40-foot battlement, landing in the center of the courtyard with a shockwave that cracked the stone. Lightning danced across her skin, arcing out to strike the nearest attackers, throwing them backward in a spray of sparks. She let out a roar. It wasn't the howl of the forest. It was a sovereign's command. The sound hit the attacking wolves like a physical hammer. Across the courtyard, dozens of the chain's warriors suddenly found their bodies betraying them. Their legs buckled. Their heads bowed. In the middle of a life-or-death charge, they were forced into involuntary, agonizing submission, their foreheads hitting the mud in the presence of the Iceni. "Stand up!" Morana shrieked, hitting one of her own men with a whip. "She is a defect. A witch. Fight!" But they couldn't. The biological imperative of the Silver Wolf was absolute. Boudicca moved like a blur of mercury. She didn't need a sword. Her hands were instruments of divine justice. She tore through the inner circle of the chain's guard, her movements a terrifying dance of silver light and crimson spray. Every time a blade touched her skin, the lightning arcing from her body shattered the steel. Bleda joined her in the fray, a whirlwind of black steel and brute force. They fought in a perfect unspoken synchronicity. When an attacker tried to flank Boudicca, Bleda's blade was there to sever the threat. When a mage aimed a spell at the warlord's back, Boudicca's lightning incinerated the magic before it could land. They weren't just two warriors fighting together. They were a binary star system, a closed loop of power and protection. Bleda glanced at her through the chaos, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of awe and a feral, growing attraction. He had claimed her to protect her, but now he realized he was fighting alongside his equal. The battle moved toward the center of the courtyard, where Elder Morana had dismounted, her face a mask of zealot's rage. She held a spear tipped with ancient black and silver, a weapon designed specifically to kill a sovereign. "You think you are a god?" Morana spat as Boudicca approached, stepping over the fallen. "You are a freak of nature. An error in the tapestry. Your mother died screaming and you will follow her." Morana lunged, the silver spear whistling through the air. Boudicca didn't dodge. She caught the shaft of the spear in one glowing hand. The silver burned her palm, the scent of singed flesh filling the air, but Boudicca didn't flinch. She leaned into the pain, her electric blue eyes boring into Morana's soul. "My mother died protecting the future," Boudicca said, her voice a layered harmony of woman and wolf. "And I am that future." With a surge of power, Boudicca snapped the ancient spear like a dry twig. She stepped forward, her hand closing around Morana's throat. The elder clawed at Boudicca's arm, her eyes bulging with terror as the silver lightning began to crawl over her skin. "You're an abomination." Morana choked out, her final act of defiance. Boudicca leaned in, her hair brushing against the elder's cheek, the heat from her body enough to blister Morana's skin. "No," Boudicca whispered, her voice cold as a glacier. "I'm a queen." A massive discharge of silver energy erupted from Boudicca's palm. Morana didn't even have time to scream before she was thrown across the courtyard, her body hitting the stone walls with a final, sickening thud. She lay still, the light of her fanaticism extinguished forever. With their leader dead, the remaining chain warriors broke. Those who weren't pinned in submission fled into the night, disappearing into the woods like shadows fleeing the sun. The courtyard fell silent, save for the crackling of the fires and the heavy breathing of the victors. The Onyx Guard began to round up the survivors, but their eyes remained fixed on the woman in the center of the square. Boudicca stood still, the silver light slowly receding into her skin, her hair returning to its pale blonde. The hybrid form faded, leaving her standing there in her torn silk robe, her hands stained with blood and soot. Bleda approached her, sheathing his sword. He didn't say anything at first. He reached out, taking her burnt hand in his fingers gentle as he inspected the silver scorch on her palm. "The healers need to look at this," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite mask. Boudicca looked up at him. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, but the heat between them was only intensifying. She looked at the carnage around them, the broken gates, the fallen fanatics, and then back at the man who had stood by her through the storm. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Let them," Bleda said, stepping closer until their chests were almost touching. "Next time we won't be waiting behind walls." The magnetic pull she had felt since she arrived, the one she thought was just the remnants of the bond, snapped into a new configuration. It wasn't the desperate tether to a master. It was the gravitational pull of a partner. Bleda's hand moved from her palm to the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His eyes were dark, searching hers for permission. Boudicca leaned in, her breath hitching as the scent of sandalwood and winter rain enveloped her. "I spent 20 years as a shadow," she said, her voice trembling with a new kind of intensity. "I'm not hiding anymore, Bleda." "Good," Bleda murmured, his face inches from hers. "Because a queen should never be in the shadows." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate collision of two storms. It wasn't a gentle romantic gesture. It was a claim, a seal of their partnership forged in the blood of their enemies. Boudicca responded with a ferocity that surprised them both, her hands tangling in his dark hair as the silver wolf purred in the back of her mind. The chain of submission had tried to break the silver wolf before she could rise. Instead, they had given her the fire she needed to forge an empire. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the warlord and the queen stood together in the ruins of the courtyard. The siege was over. The legend was beginning. And the north would never be the same again. The winter solstice had arrived, bringing with it a moon so large and luminous it turned the snow-dusted peaks of the north into jagged shards of fallen stars. A month had passed since the blood of the fanatics had stained the stones of the war citadel. In that month the world had shifted on its axis. The rumors of the Silver Wolf were no longer whispers. They were the law of the land. The great hall of the citadel was a cathedral of light and ice. Thousands of torches burned with blue-tinted flame, casting long, dancing shadows against the obsidian pillars. But the light was nothing compared to the woman standing at the head of the room. Boudicca Iceni did not wear the rags of a servant or the simple tunic of a refugee. She stood clad in silver-plate armor, articulated so finely it moved like silk. Over her shoulders hung a cloak of white wolf fur, and atop her brow rested a crown of moonstone that seemed to draw its glow directly from the sky. Beside her stood Warlord King Bleda Attila. He wore his black royal leathers, his hand resting comfortably on the hilt of his sword, but his eyes were not on the crowd. They were on her. There was no bond of fated magic between them, no divine compulsion forcing their souls together. Theirs was a connection forged in the heat of a siege and tempered in the quiet hours of recovery. It was a partnership of choice, of respect, and of a love that didn't require a goddess's permission to exist. The northern court is assembled. Bleda's voice boomed, steady and deep, vibrating through the floorboards. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. The procession was led by the high-ranking alphas of the north, men who had spent their lives measuring their worth by the scars on their chests and the fear in their subordinates' eyes. Behind them came the remains of the Bloodmoon Pack. They walked with their heads bowed, their shoulders slumped, the weight of their collective shame trailing behind them like a burial shroud. At the very front of the service line, a girl with trembling hands held a silver tray. Valdis, once the golden daughter of the Bloodmoon Beta, was dressed in the rough gray wool of a low-level servant. Her dark hair was no longer coiled in intricate braids. It was pulled back simply, and her face was devoid of the jasmine perfume she once favored. As she approached the dais, her knees knocked together. She reached the steps and held out a crystal chalice of wine to the queen. Boudicca didn't take the glass immediately. She let the silence stretch, the air growing heavy with the memory of a leather heel grinding into a servant's knuckles on a marble floor. Valdis's hands shook so violently the wine sloshed against the rim of the glass. She didn't dare look up. She was staring at the silver boots of the woman she had once called nothing. "Is the wine to your liking, Valdis?" Boudicca asked, her voice a calm, lethal melody. "Yes, Your Majesty," Valdis whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, forgive the tremor. I remember a time when you didn't care for my comfort," Boudicca said softly, finally taking the glass. "I remember a bucket of dirty water and a sheared lock of hair. Do you remember, Valdis?" Valdis dropped to her knees, the silver tray clattering to the floor. "I was a fool. I was arrogant. Please mercy, great queen." Boudicca took a slow sip of the wine, then handed the glass to Bleda. She looked out over the rest of the Bloodmoon Pack. Without Ragnar, they had fallen into disarray. They had been stripped of their status as an elite pack, their lands redistributed among those who had remained loyal to the crown. They were beggars in the very court where they had once been kings. The new Alpha of the Bloodmoon, a man who had once stood by and laughed while Boudicca was beaten, stepped forward and pressed his forehead to the cold stone. "We beg for mercy, Silver Queen," he rasped. "We acknowledge our sins. We acknowledge the Iceni blood. Do not extinguish us." Boudicca stepped to the edge of the dais. The silver light in her eyes flared, a rhythmic pulse that made every wolf in the room feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to bare their throats. "You called me the pack run," Boudicca said, her voice rising until it filled every corner of the hall, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "For 20 years, you treated me with less dignity than a diseased dog. You watched me starve. You laughed at my weakness. You beat me, and when I was no longer useful, you threw me into the snow to die." She scanned the faces, the alphas who had turned a blind eye, the warriors who had used her as a punching bag, the omegas who had stayed silent out of fear. "You believe that because I have found my power I will be a monster like you," she continued. "You think I will take your heads and salt your earth. And part of me, the part of me that still feels the scars on my back, wants exactly that." She looked at Bleda, who watched her with an unyielding pride. She turned back to the court. "But a queen does not rule through blood alone. I grant you your lives. I grant you the right to remain in the north." A collective sigh of relief breathed through the room, but it was cut short as she spoke again. "However," Boudicca's voice turned to ice, "you will not forget. The Bloodmoon Pack is hereby dissolved. You will serve as the laborers of this citadel. You will scrub these floors. You will haul the water. You will eat the scraps of those you once looked down upon. You will live in the shadows of the greatness you tried to destroy. You will remember your cruelty every single day in every ache of your bones." The judgment was final. It was a mercy that tasted like ash. "Now," Boudicca commanded, her silver eyes sweeping across the room. "Kneel." As one over 1,000 wolves hit the floor. The sound was like a clap of thunder, the sound of an entire kingdom acknowledging its new son. Boudicca sat on the argentum throne, her hand finding Bledis. He squeezed her fingers, his thumb tracing the small, faint scar on her knuckle, the only one she had refused to let the healers remove. A reminder of where she came from. "Are you satisfied, my queen?" Bleda whispered. Boudicca looked out at the sea of bowed heads. She thought of the attic closet. She thought of the cold well. She thought of the girl who had whispered, "Just a peek," through a ventilation grate. Far to the south, beyond the borders of the civilized north, a lone wolf wandered the frozen wastes. Ragnar Fenrir was a skeleton of fur and bone, his mind fractured by the loss of his pack and the shattering of his soul. He had no name, no home, and no future. He was the ghost of a man who had traded a goddess for his own ego, and he would die alone in the dark, a nameless casualty of his own arrogance. Boudicca turned her gaze back to her people. "You called me nothing," she said, her voice a final, haunting chime. "Now you kneel. Remember this. Mercy is not weakness. But neither is vengeance. I am both." The entire pack had laughed at the weak Omega. Now they would regret it for the rest of their lives. For the Silver Queen had returned, and the North belonged to the wolf. The great northern citadel, once a fortress of cold iron and bloody necessity, had transformed over the decades into the beating heart of a golden age. The winter winds still howled against the jagged spires, but inside the air was warm with the scent of pine, roasted meat, and the vibrant, thrumming energy of a bloodline that had rewritten the history of the world. 20 years had passed since the coronation of the Silver Queen. Boudicca Iceni sat by the great hearth in the royal solar, her silver plate armor replaced by heavy robes of charcoal silk trimmed in white ermine. Her hair, once jagged and dull, now fell in a thick, lustrous braid of platinum down her back. Beside her sat Warlord King Bleda, his dark hair streaked with salt and pepper, his hand still finding hers with the same possessive reverence he had shown in the forest so long ago. They were no longer just the protectors of the North. They were the architects of a dynasty. "They are late," Boudicca remarked, a playful smirk touching her lips as she looked toward the massive oak doors. "They are Iceni," Bleda countered, his voice a deep, weathered rumble. "Punctuality has always been secondary to dramatic flair in your family, my queen." As if on cue, the doors swung wide, and the future of the Northern Territories walked in. Leading the procession was the eldest, Andraste, named for the grandmother she had never met. At 19, Andraste was the living image of her mother, possessing the same winter wheat hair and startling violet eyes. However, where Boudicca had been forged in silence, Andraste was a storm of charisma. She was the diplomat, the bridge between the old ways and the new. When she shifted, her wolf was nearly as large as Boudicca's, but her fur was a shimmering pearl white, and she moved with a grace that made the council elders weep with relief. She held the southern provinces in her hand, governing not with fear, but with the sharp intelligence of a woman who knew exactly how to make an alpha feel like a king while he was doing her bidding. Following her was Valkyrie, the second daughter. Fandraste was the light, Valkyrie was the steel. She had inherited Bleda's dark hair but her mother's electric blue eyes. She didn't care for the politics of the court. She lived in the training yards and the border outposts. As the commander of the Silver Guard, she was the first woman to lead the warlord's elite forces. Her wolf was a dappled silver and charcoal, a ghost in the snow that could track a rogue through a blizzard. Valkyrie was the one who ensured the Bloodmoon descendants, now a reformed and humble caste of builders, kept their oaths. She didn't seek love, she sought order. The youngest daughter, Lyra, was the enigma of the family. Small-boned and quiet, many in the court had whispered that she was wolfless, like her mother once seemed to be. They were wrong. Lyra was a seer. Her silver eyes didn't just see the present. They caught glimpses of the threads of fate. She spent her days in the great library deciphering the ancient Iceni scrolls. When she did shift, her wolf was a translucent, ethereal silver, looking more like a spirit than a creature of flesh and blood. She was the conscience of the North, the one who reminded her siblings that power without wisdom was merely a slow-acting poison. Walking behind their sisters were the two sons, the heavy muscle of the Iceni line. Kalin, the elder son, was Bleda's shadow. He was a mountain of a young man, possessing his father's brooding intensity and broad-shouldered build. He was the heir to the warlord's mantle, a warrior who could cleave an iron shield with a single blow. Yet beneath the obsidian armor beat a heart of pure Iceni silver. He was famously protective of the Omegas in the Citadel, a trait he had learned from hearing the stories of his mother's youth. His wolf was a massive, dark iron gray with a silver mane, a beast of brute force and unwavering loyalty. He didn't want the throne. He wanted to be the wall that protected those who sat upon it. Lastly came Cyprian, the youngest of the five. He was the firebrand. With hair the color of copper and eyes that burned like molten gold, he was the only one whose shift resulted in a wolf of a deep sunset red with silver paws. He was the explorer, the one who took his pack into the unmapped wilds, bringing back stories of strange lands across the sea. He was the reminder that the North was not a cage but a starting point. The five siblings gathered around the hearth, the air thick with the comfortable overlapping scents of their wolves: ozone, cedar, snow, and iron. The border patrols report the southern alphas are complaining again, Valkyrie said, her voice a clipped, military rasp as she accepted a glass of wine from a servant. They think the tax on silver ore is too high. Let them complain, Andres said, leaning against the mantel. I've invited their heirs to the spring hunt. By the time they leave, they'll be too busy competing for a smile from our guard to worry about taxes. Bleda watched them, his chest swelling with a pride he had never imagined possible in his younger, darker years. He remembered the night he had carried an unconscious, broken girl through the forest, thinking she was a tragedy to be hidden. Boudicca stood up, her movement still possessing that fluid, predatory grace. The room went silent. The five siblings, powerful in their own right, instinctively bowed their heads. It wasn't the submission of fear. It was the recognition of the Alpha Prime. 20 years ago, Boudicca began, her voice resonating with the power of the silver wolf. This hall was a place where the weak were discarded, where a girl like me was considered a stain. Look at this room now. She looked at her daughters, the diplomat, the warrior, the seer. She looked at her sons, the wall and the fire. You carry the blood of the Iceni, she said, her eyes flashing with a sudden brilliant silver light. But you also carry the memory of the shadow. Never forget that our strength comes from the dirt we rose from. Never forget that the most dangerous wolf in the forest is the one who has been told they are nothing. She looked toward the windows where the winter moon was at its zenith. The Bloodmoon Pack is a memory. The chain of submission is dust. But the North is an empire. Bleda stood beside her, his hand moving to the small of her back. And what of the exiles, my queen? Boudicca smiled, a cold, sharp expression. Let the ghosts wander. They serve as a warning to those who think they can break a sovereign. As the night progressed, the royal family moved to the great hall, where the feast was waiting. Thousands of wolves stood and cheered, a deafening roar of "Long live the Silver Queen!" and "Honor to the Warlord." The 5 Iceni heirs took their places at the high table, a row of silver and steel that promised another century of peace. Down in the lower kitchens, a young Omega girl, a descendant of the Blood Moon survivors, was scrubbing the floors. She stopped for a moment, looking up at the high table through a gap in the service doors. She saw the queen, magnificent and unyielding, and for a second their eyes met. Boudicca didn't look away. She gave the girl a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a silent command to stay strong, to keep scrubbing, and to wait for the spark. Because the silver wolf was no longer just a legend. She was a mother, a ruler, and a goddess. And her reign would never end. The entire pack had laughed at the weak Omega. Now the world belonged to her children. I'm Luna, the story writer, and I want to give a massive thank you to all of you for watching. This story was built on the idea that our worth isn't defined by those who hurt us, but by the strength we find when we finally stand up. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more stories of powerful transformations, fated mates, and epic world building. Make sure to follow along. Before you leave though, I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of the 5 Iceni heirs was your favorite? Do you think Ragnar got what he deserved, or should Boudicca have been even more ruthless? Do you have questions about the chain of submission, or how the Silver Wolf's powers work? I'm here to dive deeper into the lore with you. Until next time.